Kia ora and welcome to today's Forest Call, telling the forestry story. This episode we grapple with another of our issues. Background first though. In February the Nelson Tasman region was hit by two ex-tropical cyclones, Feihi and Gita. Slopes failed in the torrential rain, which was very local but nonetheless very intense. Wood waste from the harvested land and a skid of mud headed down the hills. You all saw the pictures on the television and the newspapers of the slash and the failed pasture land as well. Then in June, same thing at Tolaga Bay on the east coast of the North Island. Our industry was making headlines for all of the wrong reason. In this Forest Call this week, we see what might be done about this debris flow problem and why sometimes in some places it happens. Joining us is the Forest Owners Association President, Peter Weir. Peter Weir, thank you for joining us on Forest Call and having a look at the debris flows and debris floods that have occurred over the past few months, and in particular Tolaga Bay. How much, given trees are planted at one stage and harvested many years later, was what happened at Tolaga Bay a legacy of the past?
Yeah, the Tolaga Bay debris floods were actually a function of a wall-to-wall erosion control program put in place straight after Cyclone Bola. Afforestation was indeed the appropriate treatment for that landscape, but because an entire catchment, a huge area, was planted all at once, it all came ready for harvest at once. It was replanted all at once, and then a storm hit during that window of vulnerability that occurs after harvest. It's not in the first year after harvest. Things become vulnerable from about year 2 to 5 after harvest, or given that replant always follows harvest, it's vulnerable 1 to 4 years after replanting.
So that makes any solution contingent on sorting that problem out and then shifting age classes.
Yeah, it's the way your planting determines what happens down the road. So if in hindsight's a wonderful thing, had the planting been stretched over about 5 years, so would the harvest have been. That would be a preferable way to do it. And there's a lesson there about the 1 billion trees program, about planting entire catchments and radiata destined for clearfell all at once. Perhaps that planting should be staggered in 2-year slots over 4 to 6 years rather than do an entire highly erodible catchment in one time.
You're talking about highly erodible catchments.
Yeah,
What areas are we talking about? Because we hear about orange zone, we hear about red zone, we hear about papa, we hear about separation granites. What is that mix and how important are the ratios?
About 10% of New Zealand outside the DOC estate is highly to very highly erodible. That tends to have been the cheaper land, of course, and plantation forestry in the past was directed onto that land via the Town and Country Planning Act and via catchment boards and the regional councils as a solution to it. My feeling is for that land, Manuka is probably the best use of that really highly erodible land, the red zone land. Plantation forestry, I believe, in radiata destined for clearfell is the entirely appropriate crop for orange zone land. Now we've introduced some colours that we better explain. This was an erosion map in New Zealand was created to support a resource management regulation that came into effect in May this year. It's called the National Environmental Standard for Plantation Forestry. It's got a 4-colour map. New Zealand is split up, all of New Zealand is split up into green zones, really low risk erosion zones, yellow zones, orange zones and red zones. And as I say, red comprises about 10% of all New Zealand, but past decisions put lots of plantation forestry on red zones.
We've got the NES as you described there. How quickly can that have some effect in preventing these debris flows and debris floods in the immediate future, or is this a long-term policy?
Yeah, it's a long-term thing. The effect will play out on the afforestation of new land, which now requires a resource consent to replant red zone land, so it's no longer a permitted activity, and equally a resource consent to replant red zone land. That resource consent will require a comprehensive geotechnical analysis of the land to justify the case. I would expect regional councils to absolutely give a tick to a coppicing crop like redwoods, eucalypts, totara on red zone land, but I would expect them to look long and hard for proposals to plant red zone land in Radiata, where the crop is destined for clearfell forestry 30 years out. And we think that's a good thing. It's going to protect investors from themselves as well. Yes, it steers them away from the cheapest land, but it puts them on to, in long term, a more sustainable landscape, and their returns will probably be better off orange zone land than red zone land anyway. We're not going to be able to avoid landslides and debris flows occurring when we get storms where the rainfall exceeds 25 millimetres now. Tolaga Bay exceeded 50 millimetres now, it exceeded 60 millimetres now, phenomenally heavy. In erosion-prone landscapes, under those sorts of conditions, slopes will fail regardless of the tree cover. Then it becomes a function of duration. Tolaga Bay was only 4 hours of high-intensity rain. Had that carried on at the sort of cyclone bowler length of things, I would expect it to see mature radiata crops and in fact older native forest fail, because it did in bowler. So we had the intensity at Tolaga, we didn't have the duration. Carried on that sort of heavy rainfall for a few more hours, entire landscapes will fail, just like it did in Hiroshima in Japan recently. We're not going to prevent landslides and severe storms. But there are some better ambulance at the bottom of the cliff engineering treatments we could put in. Some forest owners currently build woody debris traps. They're fairly crude things. They function really well on small streams to the scale of 20 hectares or so. They're railway irons or steel I-beams driven into the bed of a river with wire ropes strung across them, anchored to deadmans. I believe that we can do better with the engineering of those. We typically build one and only one, so if it fails unsafe. I've put the proposal up, why don't we build them in pairs? So if the first one should fail, there's a reasonable chance that the second one, maybe only 20 or 30 metres down slope, will capture it.
Is there not a solution that we could find some uses for this timber on the slopes? Not as harvested wood that's sawn up into planks, but for some other purpose such as pulp?
Well, in harvested areas close to pulp mills or close to medium density fibreboard plants, or where there's a wood pelletising plant, where there's a market for those products, indeed, you don't see them left behind because there's a market for it. The problem with the East Coast, once you get, say, beyond 100 kilometres from Gisborne, this is true of anywhere, the cost of transporting material is a break-even point and is a threshold beyond which it doesn't make economic sense to do it. Now, some forest owners may incur the extra cost to de-risk their slopes, but we'll still end up with the broken tops of trees left on slopes, because when you come right down to it, that's probably the key source of all this woody debris that remains after harvest. Every time you fell a tree, a radiata, typically the top breaks off it, and that gets left behind. So that's something we're stuck with, I think.
One of the positive signs perhaps that you could see in both Tolaga Bay and Marahau Takaka was that the landings and the roads, by and large, stayed intact. They did what they were designed to do.
Yep. Over the last 2 to 3 decades, forest engineering has improved leaps and bounds. We're spending money on culverts these days, big culverts, lots of them. And by diverting the water off roads regularly, with large pipes, we as an industry are now very good at managing runoff from our roads. So we're on top of that. 30 to 40 years ago, you would have expected roads to blow out in storms like this. You would expect lots and lots of landing failures. That doesn't and should not happen anymore. The forest engineers have lifted their game and deserve full credit for what they've done in New Zealand.
Thank you for joining us on Forest Call.
Thank you.
Still to come in Forest Call, we go to the particular risk regions, the east coast of the North Island and Tasman Bay. We're on the spot of red zone outside Gisborne and tread the slushy separation point granites of Marahau. Our planted forest industry, challenging to be our second primary export earner. Wood's environmentally good in plant and product for building and landscapes. We're great in technology and science, selecting stronger, straighter trees, safer ways to harvest them, cleaner and earthquake-resistant ways to build. Forests, regionally vital for economic development, creating all sorts of jobs. A prime future investment for our nation. Love our forests. Location, the Poverty Bay Flats, just out of Gisborne. The land's highly fertile here. If you can grow it in New Zealand, you can grow it here. But you can also have too much of a good thing. The early settlers set about that native bush and turned it into farmland. It didn't always work. Just over 30 years ago, Cyclone Bowler covered a huge part of this floodplain. The solution to hold this land together was only one thing: plant trees. Location, the Ormond Forest. It's about 45 kilometres northwest of Gisborne, on the highly erodible landscape for which the East Coast region is infamous. It's a brilliant day here today, but just a few weeks ago, Queen's Birthday weekend, north at Tolliga Bay, the heavens opened. The rain bucketed down all over that soft papa landscape, which had recently been harvested. A combination of mud and wood came down the slopes into the rivers and finished up across farmland and on the beaches. So I've come here to Ormond today to see what one company, Forest Enterprises, is doing through a range of measures to try to minimise the risk of those debris flows occurring into the future. The response to the devastation from Cyclone Bowler in 1988 was a big tree plant up. And so then the trees matured all at the same time.
So we had over 10,000 hectares of forest planted in the Gisborne region, planted dominantly in a 5-year window. And so to harvest all those on their birthday at age 27 is going to mean massive, big, large clearfall areas. And so the first part of our strategy is making sure that we create the biggest mosaic of age classes possible. We start harvest at age 24 and we continue the harvest right through to age 32, so we spread that risk over 8 years rather than 1 year.
A common solution to reduce the risk of debris flows are riparian strips of trees, such as mature indigenous forest.
Highly effective in Gisborne here has been the early plantings of poplar or willow on those old farmland blocks. And so identifying those and making sure we protect those during the harvest phase, so if you do get a landslide at the head of a gully, you've got something in place to try and prevent that landslide from migrating out and getting to the larger waterways and turning into a debris flood of wood that's going to make it out to our beaches.
Then there's often what happens when a tree is cut down.
The problem is when you fell a tree breaks. The head breaks off, the branches break off, you get shatter pieces, and those sections are unmerchantable. It is not only uneconomic, but extremely difficult to try and extract that using cable systems to try and bring that off those steep slopes. And there is research around that, how we can improve that. But so highly difficult just to get that wood off the cutover. And visually, you know, we inspect all these sites after harvest, we're making sure there's not merchantable wood left behind, and generally they appear pretty clean. But when you get a landslide, it is amazing how many sticks, even around our feet here, and bits of log do accumulate. We are using a lot of mechanised halving systems. The mechanised harvesters, so an excavator with a felling head, will grab the tree, cut the tree, and lay the tree down and have less breakage. But Gisborne has got very steep slopes, highly erodible soils, and there's a limit to how far you can take those machines. So it's inevitable we're still going to be using hand felling systems.
Wind and shallow soils create another problem.
We do get a lot of toppled trees on our unstable sites, and so in those landslides we end up with whole trees that get taken out with the landslides, because once again those toppled trees, they're rotten or unmerchantable. There is no market for them.
Burning the wastewood piles was tried, but again there's a downside.
It absolutely scorches the earth, and that scorched earth does become a source of a landslide, and so you have to be very careful of that. And also there's just a lot of risk with burning around forests. Trying to burn on a cutover, the issue, if you do get a burn going, often it'll run across, the fire will run across the cutover. It will burn all the real fine, good nutrients and good material, the fine branches and things, but it actually leaves all the big wood and debris on the cutover. And so it's going to go down in a landslide anyway.
Forest Enterprises are not just mixing the harvest age, but their cutting areas are strategic as well.
Typically in clearfall in New Zealand, once you set up a hauler or a crew on a skid site, you would log the entire setting, whether it be 5 or 10 or 15 hectares. In this case, what we're trying to do is harvest the head of the catchment and leave the bottom part of the catchment for protection. We've identified this patch of native bush down here, a pea size big enough that would help, at the head of a gully like this, would help prevent a landslide. So by the time we harvest the lower part of the catchment, this top half will be at least 3 years of age of trees. So we're at the leaning side of Raywood Contractors at the moment, and they're a highly mechanised crew, and they're processing with a processing head rather than men on chainsaws. It's a lot safer. It's the way the industry's heading, and you know, from an environmental perspective, we've got to look at minimising the risk of earthworks and things. So we are always pushing the spec of trying to shift the least amount of soil, and so that means smaller log sites. But this crew, they're trying to deal with about 14 different log length cuts at the moment. And the operator here, he's trying to optimise the maximum value from every log, and inevitably out of every stem you still end up with waste. Even the likes of this log here, it's a reasonable diameter, but it's too short to fit any specification log, so it becomes waste. We will always be trying to pick sites where there's a natural bench where we can store all the slash, because this will build up to a huge pile by the time they're finished harvesting the setting. If there's a natural bench there, it can just sit there. Forestry is doing an excellent job of slowing the erosion, but it was not the silver bullet that everyone was hoping for. Then the replant strategy for the next generation of investors, wider setbacks, smarter planting around those waterways, and having a fantastic crop. I think, you know, it's a very positive story, and we can, from an environmental perspective, we can grow a fantastic crop protecting this land.
Location Pakari Forest. We're now in northern Hawke's Bay. This is a device used by another company, J&L, to prevent slash coming down the rivers and damaging property and farmland downstream. It's I-beams or railway iron driven down into the creek bed and on the banks, and then latticed with cables. It works as a sieve. When there's a major flood and debris comes down, it backs up against this device. When the flood is over, company can go in there and excavate the wood out and safely store it to one side where it's not going to cause any further risk. It's not the most elegant looking engineering solution, but as we understand the catchment level, as we understand how we can make these things more sophisticated and more accurate, it's going to be increasingly relied on to prevent those debris flows we saw on television so recently.
Other forest engineering is much better looking. This is not there for the floods, but rather insulates the waterways from the day-to-day logging operations.
This is a culvert, obviously, but just appreciate the engineering that goes into it. This one was built by J&L. Now, they and other companies are meeting their standards set by the new National Environmental Standard for Plantation Forestry, in this instance to protect the stream bed when logging trucks go across the stream. The culvert protects that stream bed. It's just an indication, but one, of how seriously forest companies are now accepting their obligations to protect the environment.
For this catchment, the special downstream protection from all land use is for the vulnerable freshwater Whakaki Lagoon. $1.7 million hectares of our planted forests, trees locking up millions of tonnes of climate change surplus carbon from the atmosphere, then storing it in our buildings. Standing forests binding the landscape, cleaning waterways and absorbing floodwaters. A sheltering habitat for our endangered birds. Forests as places to ride your bike, go for a run. Treescapes for a fun time, sweat or relaxation among the trees. Love our forests.
Location Marahau in the Tasman district at the north of the South Island now. The soils here are also particularly vulnerable. They're not the Papa Mudstone of the east coast of the North Island, but rather they're the exotically termed Separation Point granites. And back in February, Cyclone Gita encountered them.
It's a forester and NGO field day near Motueka, hosted by Tasman Forest Management. The district had two ex-tropical cyclones through this past summer, Feihi and Gita, again with some very localised damage from intense downpours.
It's held up reasonably well, but we have had areas where standing
radiators come and slipped off the face. Yeah, but this sort of gives you a pretty good overview really of some of the area.
Separation point granite is a particular a rock type which is known to be susceptible to erosion. It's the material that forms the golden sands of Kaiteri Beach, basically. So that's what separation point granite is.
Much further downstream.
But much further downstream, of course, yes.
The cyclones were a test of modern improved road and landing engineering. Historically vulnerable places with a lot of earthworks, but this time, and the same applied at Tolaga Bay, the earthworks held up very well. To protect the hillsides, there are many strategically located riparian strips of permanent trees, usually natives.
So there's been a real focus from the beginning on trying to maintain any native riparian areas.
We know that a tree cover is certainly better than it provides more resistance against storms that cause landslides than, say, grass. In some places, choosing what kind of tree cover to put in these more erosion susceptible areas is really the key question. And you know, society's expectations change over time. We had storms like Cyclone Bola where radiata was the obvious choice at the time to put in places. Now we are starting to think, well, maybe that's not the right species in all cases. There might be places within a pine forest where native forest can be allowed to revert to provide that cover.
So one solution doesn't apply everywhere?
No, I mean, it's quite clear there are significant regional differences in erosion susceptibility across New Zealand, and that's why the NES for plantation forestry has its erosion susceptibility classification. I think there's a need to look at a finer scale within that to say, okay, yeah, this has got a high erosion susceptibility, but are there places within that actually, yeah, maybe not best suited for, say, production forests, for instance. And so you could have forests within forests, if you like.
If we're looking at planting, you know, riparian areas and that, I think what we need to stress is that's not going to be one rotation worth, it's going to be a long time out before that really starts making a difference. Because you can see some of that regenerating native hasn't stood up any better than any other land class, really. But I think if you look far enough out, yeah, that mature native does hold up well.
All New Zealand's susceptible to erosion of some form or other. Under a mature standing forest, it takes a long time and a large rain event to trigger landslides in that kind of situation. In the early stages of New Zealand's development, all those forests were removed and basically cleared the way for pasture for our early settlers. We then had a period of accelerated erosion, and we started putting trees back into our landscape, and they tended to be fast-growing conifers like Pinus radiata. And with those sorts of trees in the way in which the sort of forestry operates is roughly on a 25 to 30 year cycle. When we take the trees off, we go into what's called the window of vulnerability, and that's a period between when the trees are off and the new trees come back in to basically perform their functions of holding the soil together with their root systems and providing a canopy to reduce the effective amount of rain on the soil.
Trees are not so much vulnerable to rain as on the east coast, it's the wind which will get them, which leads to a recalculation of when to harvest.
In my experience, I think the risk of wind throw increases as you get over 24 years of age in separation point granite.
So we agree totally with Craig, you know, to shift from, say, so if you look at that and you go 15 to 30, so you shift from 30 to 25, you're taking 33% of your risk away, just on exposure. You're taking 5 of your 15 years out.
This is harvesting slash. It's the unmerchantable material or the residue of the tree that there's no market for. So we try and store it in a stable position where it's not going to go anywhere. It tends to be the slavens, which is the section off the bottom of the trunk, and the finer material, the bits that got too much bend or they don't meet the mill requirements, that sort of thing. This is an old landing here, so we've put water controls in and then we place the material on stable ground, where hopefully it'll stay and just quietly rot down over the years.
Other engineering is standard, such as using silt traps designed to intercept the silt and then settle it for safe evacuation so not running downstream. The effect of storms and the prospect of them arriving more often has led to a change not just of harvesting practices but also planting alternative species, such as the long rotation redwood. They're a tree which doesn't die and rot when they're harvested, but instead they coppice new growth. And there are other options.
We are planting 9,000 manuka in some of the worst affected areas, which we're retiring from production. So we've mapped out areas and said, look, we don't think these are suitable for Clearfell radiata.
Does that mean, though, that the core of your forest would still need to be based on radiata, because you're still going to have, rotation and keeping guys employed, etc.?
I think there'll definitely, the majority of Motueka forests, I'm talking about the wider Motueka forests, as I said, will still be radiata, but there'll be areas of that which I don't think are best suited to replanting radiata. The worst thing we could do is just walk away from this land and let it regenerate in pine. It would, environmentally, I think that'd be the worst outcome.
There are still many questions on how to best solve the risk of debris flows. It's a complex mix of regulatory, engineering, harvest practices, alternative species, and simply retiring the land from harvest. It's a long haul of anticipation, meeting now the expectations of a society 30 years or more into a stormier future.
I think, this is my view, that's going to happen more frequently, so we've got to try and manage for it.
Foresters have recently been asking NIWA whether to brace for more rain in future years.
Not necessarily more often, so we're seeing a projection for an increase in the number of dry days, so days with no rain essentially. So when it does rain, which will be less days on average, when it does rain, it will rain harder.
What evidence is there that this is happening already?
So we've seen an increase in insurance claims over the last few decades in terms of weather-related insurance claims. We've also seen more of these extreme rainfall events across the world, more intense events, larger storms, that kind of thing, and it's just starting to happen really. We've had a lot of records broken in the last few years in terms of extreme rainfall. So in Otago last year we had a very large rainfall event in July, and that set the wettest day on record for Oamaru. It was around about 160 millimetres was recorded in one day in July last year, and the previous record for Oamaru's wettest day was 56 millimetres. So that's a huge increase in that record of extreme rainfall in that location. There's certain parts of New Zealand that are more susceptible to these extreme rainfall events than others, particularly the East Cape area and Coromandel, also Nelson. They tend to get a lot more of these extreme events than others just because of their exposure to the elements, and then it doesn't help that their soils are weaker than other parts of New Zealand as well.
A perfect storm.
Double whammy.
I think it was a wonderful platform and tool that just levelled everybody into the same arena. All of a sudden, everybody could be involved in research, whereas beforehand you had to be a large forest owner with a paycheck to do it. Even if you wanted to be involved, you didn't really have the option. So what this has done is it's opened up access to the research results. They're not quite so closed anymore. It's all there. It's just easily available. And it's enabled a whole lot of projects to come into the arena that just might not have been there originally. Yeah, forestry's kind of come of age where it's seen as a land use now, not so much as a log on the back of a truck. And as we go into the next 6 years, there's a whole lot of stuff that if we take existing learnings or build on those, we could really see some good results in the right species, right place come out of this.
That's Forest Call for today. It's time to sign off with a look of what's coming up next week. Ka kite. Next week on Forest Call, we look at some amazing technology developed by Scion here in Christchurch to spot and track insect pest incursions. It's wiring up the antennae of a male moth, putting it in a machine, and then taking it out to look for pheromones in the female.